allele patterns beyond simple Mendelian genetics so that we can identify more complex methods of inheritance, and our success criteria is being able to differentiate between complete, incomplete, and codominance. So all of the traits that Mendel worked with showed what we call complete dominance, where the dominant phenotype completely overpowers the recessive. Mendel got lucky because all of the traits he studied showed the same type of complete dominance pattern, because there are two other common patterns of inheritance that are out there, as well as more complex ways that genes and alleles can interact. So the two most common are incomplete dominance and codominance. And there is a difference between the two, even though they are fairly similar and they sound very similar in names. Both of these patterns, because it's not actually complete dominance anymore, sometimes they use letter notation, just like our regular Mendelian traits do, but they can also use number or prime notation. And some people favor this because it no longer implies there's a dominance of one allele over the other. In incomplete dominance, what we see is the blending of traits. So you have two phenotypes that are coded for by two different alleles, but if you end up with a heterozygote for that trait, the phenotype ends up somewhere in the middle of the other two, not the dominant phenotype overpowering the recessive. Classic example of this is flower colors. For some species, if they have plant has one type of flower that's a red flower and another that's a white flower, you mix those two individuals together and the offspring will have pink flowers. Breed two pink flowers together, and depending on which alleles get passed on, they could actually create offspring that have red flowers, pink flowers, or white flowers. Now, an important thing to note with incomplete dominance is that the heterozygote phenotype will not necessarily be exactly in the middle. Sometimes it skews closer to one side than the other, and that's okay. As long as it's somewhere in between the two phenotypes, it's still incomplete dominance. Using the same example of flower color, this is how we would do it with number notation. Instead of big R, little r, it's R1 and R2. And prime notation uses the prime value from mathematics, which looks like an apostrophe. So you have R and R primed being red and white respectively in prime notation. Either of those notation types work. Then we have an example of where the blending of the traits is not exactly in the middle. Sickle-cell anemia, which we often like to talk about in evolution, is also a great example with genetics. Sickle-cell anemia is a very debilitating condition. It changes the shape of hemoglobin in the red blood cells, which also changes the ability of red blood cells to absorb oxygen as well as their shape. And what that often means is that people who have sickle cell anemia oftentimes run out of breath very easily, and they're very, very prone to their blood clotting, which can be debilitating or even deadly. If you have two copies of the sickle cell anemia gene, or the sickle cell gene, you have sickle cell anemia. If you have two regular copies of the hemoglobin, you just have regular hemoglobin in your body. But people who have regular hemoglobin are prone to the malaria parasite. And the people who have sickle cell anemia are not. So there is something as well where you're a sickle cell carrier. You have one regular allele and you have one sickle cell allele. And this is an interesting case because it shows what we call a heterozygous advantage, where the blending of the two traits through incomplete dominance actually creates an advantage for individuals who are heterozygous. They might be slightly anemic. It's slightly more difficult for the heterozygotes to absorb oxygen, but it's not really dangerous to them. Their red blood cells don't often change shape, which means they aren't prone to the really dangerous parts of sickle cell anemia, and they can still absorb about 80% of the oxygen that a person with completely normal hemoglobin would. But what that also means is they're immune, or they're also partially immune to the malaria parasite. They have resistance to the malaria parasite, and it's not 50. Again, it's in about that 70 to 80% range if you try and pin a number on it. So they have some of the traits of the sickle cell disease, but they also don't have some of the disadvantages. The other type of inheritance we can talk about is codominance. So where incomplete dominance is a blending of traits, codominance, co is like cooperative or working together, while codominance means that both phenotypes are expressed together. So instead of red and white blending to create pink, both red and white get expressed completely. A good example of this is often in herd animals. So cows and bulls can come in red or they can come in white in some breeds. If you breed a red bull and a white cow together, you don't end up with pink cows. You end up with roan cows. And roan just means red and white. They have a mixed hair color, but individual hair fibers are either completely white or completely red. Both phenotypes are getting expressed equally. They're equally dominant, but they're also equally expressed. We often observe this in color patterns, but we'll see later that we can also see it in blood type. So in chickens, you can breed a black and a white chicken together, and instead of getting a gray chicken, in some varieties, you end up with birds who have these striped feathers, where they're expressing both black and white. Same thing that happens in cows happens in horses as well, except it's more often black and white instead of red and white. So the hairs are thoroughly mixed together, but it doesn't create this gray pattern. It creates kind of a mottled pattern, and people actually sometimes call it blue. I don't think it looks blue, but they'll call these roan horses blue. But what it really is they're expressing both black and white at the same time.